Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure for us to come back and give this presentation one more time. I'm going to move our pictures over to the corner here, so because we want everyone to be able to see the slides in the background. Gave this presentation at the 100th anniversary of the Padgett Message, hosted by the Foundation Church of the New Birth back in 2014. I think it was the 100th anniversary of the first message from Jesus, actually. And we had a wonderful gathering and some wonderful times, memories from that. So what we did is we updated a few slides. There has been some new information that we have found in the past years, and our research continues as we carry on with the history of Mr. James Padgett. Now, exactly who am I and why did I do this? Back in 2014, I didn't tell the story how I came to find the Padgett Messages. I am an attorney. I practice in Southern California. I practiced in San Diego for 10 years and then moved to San Bernardino, and I now work for the county of San Bernardino. And 10 years ago, in 2010, we went to visit, Susie and I went to visit a dear friend of ours. She's the vice president of Pala Casino, and we were having lunch with her, and in the middle of the lunch, she says, "Have you guys ever been to a medium?" I said, "A medium? A medium? What are you talking about?" She goes, "A medium, you know, those people who talk to the dead people." "No, I've never been to a medium." She goes, "We have a medium, and you guys just have to come and see this medium." So again, this is before I learned anything about divine love. We go to see this medium at a casino. How could anything go wrong, right? So we're in a small group of about 10 or 11 people, and my sister was supposed to go. And of course, she canceled at the last minute, so Susie joined me. And we went to see this medium. He's a very fine medium. It was about a 2-hour session, and he gave messages from everybody's loved ones that was there in this spirit circle, if you will. And I received the most wonderful messages from my grandmother, warning about my mother's upcoming passing, and worrying about my brother. And it was so detailed. It was so detailed. There was no way anyone could have told him in advance what the details were that he disclosed about my brother who had been taking care of my mother. And without going any further in that, after I left this meeting, I was so astonished. I says, if mortals can really take messages from spirits, there's got to be something like this online. I got to do research. I need evidence. I'm an attorney. I need evidence. So that's what started 10 years ago, 2010. I stumbled upon Mr. Cutler's website, Jeff Cutler, who's done a tremendous amount of work. But as I read the messages, I just kept saying to myself, who is this guy? If he was an attorney, I'm an attorney, he would leave a record. There would be cases that he handled. There would be case files. He may have had an appeal that went to a higher court, and that appeal got published in what we call case reporters. There would be evidence. I knew there would be evidence. So to begin this off, we're going to start with one little section of the Penal Code, Section 1096, and I promise not to bore you to death with a lot of law, but you've probably seen this section in one form or another on all your crime television shows. It's what we call the standard of proof in a criminal trial, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the toughest standard to meet. We actually will incarcerate people for life, possibly even put them to death, using this standard. So it's a very high standard. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt that leaves you with an abiding conviction that a fact is true. The evidence need not eliminate all doubt, because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. So with that as my standard, I set a pretty high standard. But then I also remember some parts of the evidence code, and again, this is the last of the law, I promise you. Except where additional evidence is required by statute, the direct evidence of one witness is enough. One witness who's entitled to full credit is sufficient to prove any fact. We call this the single witness rule. If you bring one person on the stand to establish a fact, you have established that fact. Somebody else could bring 100 other witnesses on the other side to give their version of the facts, but you only need one witness. So, reasonable doubt, one witness. I started my journey. So when we talk about Mr. Padgett, we have to put it in the context of what was going on in America back in the 1850s. I know it seems like a long time ago, but we have to go back. And at that time, this is a 31-star flag. At that time, we had just finished the Mexican-American War, and there was a lot of turmoil. By the way, California was the 31st star on that flag. And the big issue of the day in the country was slavery. And particularly, after the war, there was new territories that wanted to be accepted into the state, into the Union. And would they be slave states or would they be free states? So this was a lot of argument going on in Congress. And they came up with the Great Compromise of 1850. And as you see on this screen, there was, I'll get my face out of the way for a second. They came up with 5 separate legislative acts as the Great Compromise. Texas gave up its claim to New Mexico. California was added as a free state, became the 31st state. New Mexico and Utah could choose slavery. They called that popular sovereignty. And the one that really was the straw on the camel's back, passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, and they banned slave trading in Washington, D.C. So that is the era that we find Padgett being born into. So what happens? 1852. Well, Henry Clay died. He was a congressman, a senator. He was also, I think, the 7th Secretary of State for the United States. He died, and he was the first one with the honor of lying in state, his body lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Daniel Webster also died. He's also another politician, statesman. He was also Secretary of State. And Harriet Beecher Stowe penned the popular book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And our friend James Edward Padgett was born. 1852, a busy year. So here's a picture of Henry Clay, first one to lie in state in the U.S. Rotunda. There's a picture of Mr. Daniel Webster and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So when that book came out, it sold about 300,000 copies in the United States that first year, but it sold almost 1 million or over 1 million in England. I read somewhere that they had 17 separate press companies running full-time just to keep up with printing Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, finally got to meet Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So this is the little woman who started this great war." So, Padgett was born August 25th, 1852, and he passed into his reward in spirit March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1923. He lived his entire life in the District of Columbia. And he was a young boy during the Civil War. He was only a little over 8.5 years old when the war began, and he was a little more than 12.5 years old when the Civil War ended. So that's a good chunk of a young man's life to live during wartime. And you say, well, why would that make such a big deal? Well, as you see in this picture here, the cannons, they literally surrounded the District of Columbia. It became the most fortified city in North America. Can you imagine growing up in a city that's surrounded by all this armory? the population swelled from 60,000 in 1860 to over 200,000 with all the soldiers and all the related people. And as you can see in this photo, since the soldiers were stationed right around the city, the families would go out and visit their husbands, their brothers, out in the camps. As you can see from this photo, the Capitol building was still under construction. Here is a photo from 1861, and this is actually Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration. Now, Abraham Lincoln is key in the James Padgett story, as we'll discuss a little bit more later. But on that stage, only 4 feet from Abraham Lincoln, was his friend from Ohio, Mr. Albert G. Riddle. And we'll talk about both gentlemen a little more. This is Mr. William Tecumseh Sherman, actually General Sherman. And in one of the messages, and this is what I love about the Padgett messages, is that he has a conversation with them. And you could tell by the answers, they might start a sentence with yes or no, or they'll start a sentence with well, as they pause to contemplate the answer that they're going to have for James' question. So in this particular message, James must have asked General Sherman, hey, we met, do you remember? You shook my hand, blah, blah, blah. And here's what the general said. Going to do my best, General Sherman. Well, my dear boy, I'm certainly glad that you recalled these reminiscences. Of course, with all the people that I met in those days, I cannot remember you, as we only had a passing handshake. But I'm certainly glad that you recalled those times, and more glad that I can be with you now. And things will be reversed now, for I will be the one who will not forget, while you, considering the great number of spirits who come to you to write, and the great number who are around you ready to write, I hardly expect you will find time to give me much thought. I won't do any more impressions. When we were at the 100th anniversary, we did make it over to the Smithsonian. This is a shot of the general's service cap and his officer's sword. Susie also took this picture of Abraham Lincoln and a picture of his hat that he wore on that fateful night, that last night in Ford's Theater. And this was President Lincoln's funeral procession that went down the streets of Washington, D.C., April 15, 1865. Padgett was only a little over 12 and a half years old. He could have very possibly have seen this procession going down the streets of Washington, D.C. As I said, he lived his entire life in the district. So we're going to talk a little bit about his education. We know from a couple of testimonies from Dr. Stone and James Padgett himself that Padgett attended the Newmarket Polytechnic Institute. Well, I want evidence. Was there such an institute? Did it really exist? There's a book I found, The History of Shenandoah County, that shows that the Newmarket Polytechnic Institute first opened September 5th, 1870, and it says Salyards and Benton principals. Salyards. That name sounds familiar. This is not the academy. This is called the Newmarket. I'm sorry, this is not the Polytechnic Institute. This was the precursor. I did find this little flyer, and I didn't find much more on the Polytechnic Institute, but our dear friend, Mr. Paul King, has done an amazing job in researching this, and he actually made a visit to Virginia and has some more information about the Institute and James Padgett attending there. But this little flyer just advertises a new session. So more evidence. So this single-story building was the academy, the Newmarket Academy in Virginia. It did exist. And then they added this portion in the back and it became the New Market Polytechnic Institute. Now, while Padgett was attending there, he met a man by the name of Joseph Salyards, Professor Joseph Salyards. He taught in the Valley for 50 years, 50 years. So he must have taught hundreds and hundreds of pupils, many of which became leaders in our nation. And he was well-respected, prestigious professor. He spoke, I think, at least 5 languages. Oh, by the way, that is a sketch by one of his students, and that is his signature, Joseph Salyards. The picture on the left is Herbert Barbie. He's an American sculptor who studied in Europe. And here he is in his studio in Germany, I believe, yeah, Hamburg. And he is sculpting a bust of Joseph Salyards, who he comments is famous educator and poet. Would I be able to find a photo of Mr. Salyards? Yes, here is Professor Salyards. And he ultimately wrote at least 22 messages to his former student, Mr. James Padgett, via automatic writing. Now, this is a new image. This is one of the most famous poems that Professor Salyards wrote. And the funny thing about this image, you'll never guess where I found this one. No, it wasn't in the National Archives. It wasn't any venerable place. I got this from Walmart.com because apparently they're selling this on Walmart. Continuing with James's education. Back in those days, you didn't necessarily have to go to law school. You could be an apprentice with an attorney and take your bar examinations and start practicing law. And that's exactly what Mr. Padgett did. Now, how do I know that he started studying law in 1873? The only evidence that I have, and again, I'm looking at evidence, was his directory would say that he is living with Mr. Riddle, or it is associated with the address of Mr. Riddle. Mr. Riddle was the congressman from the 19th District of Ohio, and Albert Riddle was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln. He was such a good friend of Abraham Lincoln that when Lincoln came to Ohio to campaign for his presidential election, Lincoln asked Albert, I'm going to call him AG for short, AG, hey, come with me. Why don't you go on my campaign with me? I think we're a good team. I think you'd be great to have on my campaign trail. But Albert Riddle declined, and he stayed in Ohio because he was also running for Congress. And that election resulted in both President Lincoln being elected president for the first time, and it also brought Mr. A.G. Riddle to Washington, D.C. as a congressman. Now, in one of the books by Mr. Riddle, and he's written 14 or 15 books, he recalls that his daughter and his law partner, Francis Miller, were both in the theater, Ford's Theater, when Abraham Lincoln was shot. He said that Francis Miller jumped on the stage and he went chasing after Mr. Booth, only to have a door slammed in his face. And by the time he got the door open and looked outside, Wilkes Booth had just gotten away on a horse that was already waiting for him. So in 1876, Padgett began the practice of law. Now, how do I know he began practicing in 1876? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Washington, D.C., absent the Civil War, was not that large of a community. And if you did anything, it was in the newspaper. Whether you liked it or not, it was in the newspaper. Good news, bad news, it was in the newspaper. And when you are practicing law, you are not allowed to advertise your name in the name of the law firm unless you are an attorney. So even though this particular advertisement came out in 1877, I did find other newspapers that showed that Padgett was representing clients in the year before in 1876. But I did find this little advert for the law firm of Riddle, Miller, and Padgett. And then you're going to see that Padgett was associated with several law firms. Stewart and Riddle, Riddle and Thrasher, Riddle and Miller, Riddle, Miller and Padgett, Riddle, Davis and Padgett, Riddle, Padgett and Davis, Riddle and Davis, James Padgett when he practiced as a sole practitioner, Padgett and Coombe, Padgett and Forrest. He practiced with Forrest for 18 years, and he also practiced with another gentleman, Mr. William Minogue, or Minogue, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. So he practiced with a lot of attorneys, and these were pretty prestigious attorneys, especially his mentor, A.G. Riddle, well known as a congressman, personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. Riddle would go to dinners at the White House. There are letters from A.G. Riddle to the president, and those are in the National Archives, and you can read those. There's some good reading. After Padgett developed his mediumship skills, he received messages from many of his former attorney friends and law partners. A.G. Riddle, he received at least 33 messages. Edwin Forrest, who he practiced law with for 18 years, about 13 messages. Richard Ross Perry, at least 9 messages. Hugh Taggart, at least 5 messages, and others. Now, I say at least in these sentences because we don't know for certain how many messages got lost. We know that when Padgett first became a medium, he didn't even save the messages. He tossed them or threw them aside, and he wasn't logging them. So I say at least. There may be more messages out there, but we don't know. Or at least I didn't. So in one of the earliest recorded messages, and I say recorded, is one from A.G. Riddle. And the apparent question that James had to Mr. Riddle was, this was in a series of messages where James Padgett's father says that, okay, son, you've got this gift. We're going to form a band, and we're going to protect you from the spirit side. And after his father and some other people speak, A.G. Riddle speaks. So the question must have been, hey, A.G., are you going to be one of the members of my band that's going to do this work? And here's Riddle's response. Yes, I am. And I'll be one of the band. You will not be annoyed by any others than the ones your father has named. I will write you what my beliefs and thoughts are of the life here so that you may know that I'm just a spirit in search of the truth. You will see that I'm not one who knows everything, but will try to learn whatever is possible and will tell you what I learned. And he asked him another question, and he said, yes, and I will let you see that I have my mustache and goatee just as I did in my early life. So I knew when I found a photo of this guy, he's going to have a mustache and a goatee. And boy, ever does he have a mustache and a goatee. This is Albert G. Riddle. So in 1877, A.G. Riddle, prestigious lawyer of the district, was appointed as the attorney for the District of Columbia. Now, I don't want people to get that confused with the phrase district attorney, because in the United States, every county has a district attorney who handles all of the criminal law matters for that county. This would be the equivalent if the district was a state. Each state has an attorney general, and the attorney general is in charge of enforcing all the laws in the state. This would be the equivalent of being the District of Columbia's Attorney General. And Mr. Riddle was in charge of enforcing all of the laws of the district. So who did he bring with him? Well, he brought his senior law partner, Francis Miller, as an assistant attorney to the District of Columbia. And he brought Mr. James Padgett as special assistant attorney to the District of Columbia. Just wanted to make that distinction. Padgett was not a district attorney. He was a special assistant attorney to the District of Columbia. And when you work for the government, everything gets published. I should know I work for county government. Here's a little directory that shows that Attorney A.G. Riddle was the attorney for the district, and the assistant attorney was Francis Miller, and the special assistant attorney was J.E. Padgett. Also, this just happens to be when Padgett practiced as a sole practitioner. This is a copy of his letterhead, and that is his signature. I copied that from another document, which you'll see a little bit later. So after the passing of Mr. Riddle's law partner, Francis Miller, in 1888, Riddle brought in another guy, Henry Davis, and made him the assistant attorney. And you say, wait a minute, why would he bring in this other guy, Henry Davis, and make him in a position above James Padgett? Well, Henry Davis was his son-in-law. So, blood is thicker than water, I guess. And this is a picture of Mr. Davis, Henry Davis. When you work for the government, you got to do reports, usually every fiscal year. And here's a report filed by the attorney for the district. This one here discloses how much they made. And I don't know if you can see, I'm going to try to do this on the laser here. But over here in this corner, Albert Riddle made $4,000 a year. Henry Davis made $2,000 a year. And James Padgett, well, he only made $1,200 a year. So Padgett, at that time, was making $100 a month as the special assistant attorney for the District of Columbia. $100 a month. It was probably good money back then. But then look below here. I'm going to see if I can zoom in on this real quick. Edwin Forrest was the clerk. He knew him before he was an attorney. And look who was the messenger. William Minogue, or Minogue, I don't know how you pronounce that. He was the messenger. If you remember, both of these gentlemen ended up being attorneys, and James Padgett practiced law with both of them inside of a law firm situation. So there was the Padgett and Forrest and Padgett and Minogue law firms. Look, Edwin Forrest made the same amount of money, $1,200. How's that fair? Oh, well, here's that report. So the district writes a report on how many cases they tried that year. Number of cases, 7,211 cases. That's a lot of cases. That's over 138 cases a week. These guys were really busy. How many convictions? 6,479 convictions. That's a lot of convictions. That's over a 90% conviction rate. These guys were good, too. And look at some of the cases. Bar open after hours, cow yard. I don't know what a cow yard was, but you could be cited for that. Disorderly in the church, disorderly in the county, disorderly in the school, driving through a funeral. How terrible. That's just terrible. So these are the kind of cases that Padgett prosecuted. This is the second page of the report. Much more of the same, the types of cases. If you left your female dog at large, well, that was a violation. Firing a pistol on a Sunday, you can't do that. Look down at the bottom who it's signed by. James E. Padgett, Special Assistant Attorney for the District of Columbia, and authorized or signed off by Mr. A.G. Riddle, too, down on the bottom, his boss. So they worked for the government as the district's attorneys for 10 years. And I thought, working for the county's kind of or the government's kind of a good gig. I got that gig myself right now. I'm working for the county of San Bernardino. Why would he quit after 10 years? Well, this coincided with A.G. Riddle's retiring. You see, A.G. Riddle, he's been around Washington, D.C. a long time. He's 73 years old at this time in 1889. And also, his wife of many years was ill. As a matter of fact, she did not make it past December of this year. She died in December of 1889. So that's the reason why A.G. Riddle retired. And when he retired, all of the people that he brought into the office left with him. This is a little notice acknowledging the receipt. The court was publishing this in the newspaper, Acknowledging the receipt of the resignation of the Special Assistant Attorney, James Padgett, the commissioners, which is the judges, expressed their high personal regard for him and commend the manner in which he discharged the duties of his office during the many years of his incumbency. And another article, the police court, which was very close to where Padgett had a office on 6th and D, was a very nice comment in here with regards to the retiring officer. The judge said that during the 10 years Mr. Padgett had held the office, he had given great satisfaction both to the public and to his superior officials. The office is one that requires great skill, judgment, tact, and above all, integrity. And let me tell you, as a practicing attorney, all you have is your integrity. If you lose your integrity with the court, and it gets out that you either misrepresented the court or were not completely candid with the court, it is very bad for you as a practicing attorney. So it was very nice to see that after practicing for 10 years that the judge said that he had high integrity. Helen Warman Hyde. Did she really exist? I don't know. I want evidence. She was born October 23rd, happens to be the same day as my brother and my father were born on that day. She was about 10 years younger than James. She was the daughter of Reverend George Watson Hyde and Susan Olivia Whitehill. The Whitehill name, turns out, is pretty historic in the United States. We'll get into that in a moment. So I learned that Helen was baptized at St. Paul's Methodist Church in Hagerstown. Oh, can't see it. So was there such a church? Yes, we found it. That's a picture of St. Paul's in Hagerstown. So the Whitehill side of Helen's family, they could trace their heritage all the way back to folks who fought in the American Revolutionary War, not the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, 100 years earlier in 1776. Well, why does that make any difference to us? Well, it allowed not only Helen, but her children and anyone in her lineal descent to apply for membership in the prestigious associations of the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. And that's what their pins and logos look like. Again, what does this have to do with Padgett? Well, one of Padgett's grandchildren applied for a membership in the Sons of the American Revolution. What does that mean to me? As a researcher, we found his application. Edward Riddle Padgett Jr. ended up applying for this particular society or association. And what do you have to do to prove it? If you look here, you have to give names and birthdays and marriage dates and death dates. Wow, to someone who's researching, we just hit the jackpot. So we're very certain of the dates regarding the birth of Padgett, the death of Padgett, the birth of Helen, the death of Helen, their marriage date. This is only one piece of evidence. So as I mentioned, her father, Reverend Hyde, was a minister for 55 years. When you're a minister, you get to live in a minister's house called a parsonage. And little Helen was only 2 years old when she arrived at this house. I'll get rid of the laser there. And the local historic society took pictures just before they tore this house down. And this is the back side. I could see Helen running down that little hill, and she was there from 2 years old to 5 years old, so she was there for 3 years. This is the inside of the house, pretty big cupboards. I could see her trying to crawl up those stairs when she was only 2, but probably by the time she was 5, she's probably running up those stairs. She kind of wrecked the living room, though. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. This is the condition was the house before they demolished it. The stairs, top of the stairs. This is the kitchen. Big, that's where they cooked it. That was the stove. So we were lucky to fall upon these photographs of the home of Reverend George Hyde and his wife and his little daughter. Now, a lot of our research comes from the census records, and we learned in the census records of 1870 that the Hydes lived in Hancock, Maryland, and they had an 8-year-old daughter named Helen. And then it jumps all the way 10 years later to 1880, and now they've got a younger brother and a younger sister. They got Eugene and Nancy. But what it doesn't show you, and what we learned by actually going to the cemetery, is that there was 2 babies born in between there that did not survive. So Helen had a little brother named Walter Clemson Hyde. He lived about 3 years. And another little brother, Howard Hyde, that lived only 3 months. We did find some photographs of relatives of Helen. This is Rebecca, Mary, and Elizabeth Hyde. These are Helen Hyde's aunts. And also one uncle, Jacob Hyde. I love his coat. So they finally meet. James and Helen finally meet. It's a small town. She is the daughter of the local minister. He is an attorney for a prestigious law firm. And after a brief courtship, the 2 get married on December 15th, 1880. I don't know exactly when they met, but we do know they met and married in the same year. We have newspaper evidence that they got a marriage license. This is the announcement of the marriage licenses, and you can see the little highlight, James E. Padgett and Helen W. Hyde. You notice that Hyde switches H-Y-D-E and H-E-Y-D-E, which became problematic in some instances when you're researching. So you just have to look under both spellings. It goes back and forth. They drop the E sometimes. And this, we were lucky to find, is the actual certified copy of Helen and James' marriage certificate. We held this in our feeble little researcher hands, and if you look down here, who was the Reverend? Why, by gosh, it was George W. Hyde. Her father did the ceremony. Then came the Padgett children. Who was first? Edward Riddle Padgett. So James was so enamored or so glad he had his mentor, Mr. Riddle, that he gave his firstborn son the middle name of Riddle Padgett in honor of A.G. Riddle. Second was Harry Hyde Padgett about 2 years later. And then, of course, their young daughter, Helenita Padgett. Padgett's in the news. Like I mentioned, if you did anything in the district, it ended up being in the news. So this was the kind of fun part of the research, because you were running across all these crazy things that the Padgetts did. And I won't bore you with a lot of it, because we literally have hundreds of clips from the newspaper. There was that time that Helen returned from the seashore, and she now had malarial fever. It was 1893. And, of course, you want everybody to know that. In 1890, there was a large influenza, much like COVID. It was called the grip. And James Padgett contracted the grip, but it said that he recovered in this little clip. So they were just like you and us, living through pretty much the same things that we're living through. Here's an article that I found. This is from 1905, the Washington Post. Helen was elected, Mrs. Padgett was elected the president of the Nordhoff Guild. So I scoured every record for a picture of the Nordhoff Guild to see if they had a picture of the officers. No such luck. But it was in the newspaper. Here it is. Mrs. Padgett and the sons are going to travel with these other folks and go to Ocean Grove. How nice. Here's my absolute favorite. Mrs. James Padgett of 3410 Morgan Avenue will not be home tomorrow. Nothing like announcing to all the burglars that you're not going to be home, and then publishing the address, too. I thought that one was rather funny. So Edward Riddle Padgett was born February 17, 1882. He attended Emerson Institute. That was a very prestigious private school. General Grant, who later became President Grant, sent two of his sons to Emerson Institute, and also Garfield, Congressman and President Garfield, also sent one of his children to Emerson Institute. So that's where Edward went to school. He also attended St. John's College. St. John's College claims to be the oldest college in the United States, not because it was St. John's. It was originally King William's College in the 1600s. I can't remember the year, early 1600s, and then it changed to St. John's. Don't let the name fool you. St. John's, it's not a religious school. In fact, it is a military school. So when you see the pictures, they're wearing military uniforms. So Edward Riddle Padgett, he graduated fourth in his class. How do we know? It's in the newspaper. District man, fourth in his class. And down in the little red box, tells you that he got his Bachelor of Arts degree. And his relative standing is fourth in his class of 19. Congratulations. And here is a picture of Edward Riddle Padgett. This is from their yearbook, the St. John's yearbook called the Rat Tat, 1903. And here's a few things that his friends had to say. His nickname was Pigeon Padgett. And a quote, "At church, with meek and unaffected grace, his looks adorned the venerable place." And another person wrote, "An honor system advocate on weekdays, a preacher on Sunday, and a lover of moonlight on evenings, dances divinely and bluffs remarkably well, all out for Glee Club." And it's time to find the Padgett in the picture. So here he is with his Phi Sigma Kappa friends. Can you pick him out? I'll give you a little help. The little red arrow points to him right there. He's in that top row, left-hand side. Here he is with the Glee Club. Find the Padgett in the picture. This one's easy. He's in the front row. There he is. Dashing young man. Here, I don't know how you pronounce this, Philocalian Society. That was kind of like a religious society. And if you remember, his friends said he was going to be a preacher, and I thought that was odd because that's not ended up being his profession. Where's the Padgett in this one? He's right here on the end. To make it easier for you, we kind of blow up that one. Now, I personally think he looks like his father, but I'll let you be the judge when this is over. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it's kind of funny what his colleagues wrote about himself. And we'll make the entire slideshow available if you just want to read it. And, of course, they're recording this presentation. But they had a lot of respect for Mr. Padgett, and they thought he was going to be a bishop. Well, look at what this is that we found. He actually entered divinity school. The Divinity School of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, December 16, 1904, Edward Riddle Padgett. But he didn't end up being a preacher. You see, when he went to St. John's, he really liked being an editor of the Rat Tat, the yearbook. And if you can see here, he was associate editor on this page. And he ended up going into the newspaper business. This next one, there was wedding bells for Mr. Padgett. This is Edward Padgett, the first child of Helen and James. I'm not going to spend too much on this one because this one didn't last. It wasn't the one. But he got married in 1908. And he tried again. In 1914, he married Edith Crane. We also found this marriage certificate. And if you notice, it does say Edward R. Padgett was divorced and Miss Crane was divorced. So, good for Edward for keep on trying. I like that. Guy after my own heart. Then the war drums were beating. It was World War I. Now, if you remember, Edward went to a military school and he had a degree. So he thought, I'm going to enlist or apply for a commission as captain in the military intelligence branch of the Army. Military intelligence sounds like an oxymoron. Oh, I digress. So he applied to work for this gentleman, Colonel Marlborough Churchill. When we went to England with the Divine Love Group, we stopped at the birthplace of Winston Churchill, and it is named after the Duke of Marlborough. And now you know where this gentleman gets his name, Marlborough Churchill, and he is related, distant relative of Winston Churchill. And Edward Riddle got to work for him as a captain in the Army. Now, how do we know that? This is the letter where he's asking one of his friends for a recommendation. And down at the bottom, you can see Edward's autograph. Well, then his friend turned around and wrote a letter to the colonel. Dear Colonel, I got this buddy. He wants to serve, in your particular group. And we know that it happened because later it says that he served in the Army as a captain. So Edward moves to Detroit, and he falls in love again. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead too quick. This was a great clip to find because it gave a little history of his work. Mr. Padgett was the Sunday editor of the Washington Star for 10 years. Prior to that, he was Sunday editor of the Cincinnati Enquirer, and the city editor of the Louisville Post. Then he fell in love again. This time he married Dora Adele Styron, and she had a married name of Simpkins. We couldn't find the actual certificate, but this is the wedding registry. And if we look close, you'll do see that it's Edward Padgett, and the father is James Padgett and Helen Hyde. That's over here on this side. This is just evidence. They had a child. I couldn't find any baby pictures, but we have Edward Riddle Padgett Jr. He's the young man who filed that application to become a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. And here's one of his college pictures. So this is James and Helen's first grandchild. And new from the last time we gave this presentation, here's Edward Riddle Jr. with his wife. And her name was Elizabeth Betsy Winter. She just happened to go to the same high school as Helenita did, but we'll get to that. So that's a new photo. Now, I really have a strong feeling for Edward. Poor Edward, he buried his mother, he buried his sister, he buried his father, and then just recently we found out that he had an infant child that died, then he buried him. He finally finds love on the third try, third time's a charm. He has a child of his own, he returns to Washington, D.C., and he has a heart attack, and he died in 1925, shortly after James Padgett had died. So, Sunday editor of the Baltimore Sun dead. So he left behind his little Edward Jr. Now, if those rows of headstones look familiar, it's because it is Arlington National Cemetery. And yes, Edward Riddle Padgett, captain in the military intelligence, along with his wife, Dora Adele Padgett, are buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, it's kind of a funny story. Edward was cremated like his father, and his ashes were actually sent to Frederick, Maryland, to be buried at the Hyde family plot. And a colleague said, wait a minute, he's a captain in the Army. They literally retrieved the ashes and took it to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So it's quite an honor. The next child, Harry Hyde Padgett. He was born just a couple of years after Edward. And they were very close. They did everything together. And I'm so happy that they loved music and singing. They were both members of the Glee Club. One of the little articles we found, they got to spend, I think it was a 10-day trip, having a great time, brothers growing up in Washington, D.C. Well, Harry had to just follow his brother to St. John's College. He too was in the Glee Club. Time to find the Padgett in the picture. Which one is Harry Padgett? I'll help you out. There he is. Yes, he played the guitar. This is Harry. I think, this is a personal opinion, he must look like Helen, and we'll tell you why in just a second when we get to Helenita. But he looks different than his other brother. All right, let's see. Here they are again, the Philocalian Society. He's hiding in the top row, way up here. You can't hardly see him. So we'll blow his picture up. That's the youngest picture we have of Henry Hyde Padgett. Now, I say Harry Henry because he changed his name to Henry, as we're going to find out. Here's another picture. Find the Padgett in the picture. He's right next to the director, Glee Club director. There he is. Now, remember, he joined his brother in college, so they were actually at the same year in college at the same time. So in this photo, the sophomore class of 1902, we have two Padgetts. So down in the front row is Edward Riddle Padgett, and the top row is Harry Padgett. So now, Harry didn't get his degree. He dropped out. Don't know why. He moves to Baltimore in 1903, but then later he moved to Chicago, and he was working as a clerk in the railroad industry. And just very similar to what happened to his brother, World War I broke out. Oh, I got ahead of myself. He meets, in Chicago, he meets Hazel Kirk Hamilton. I have a lot of affection for Hazel because Helenita and Helen had a lot of affection for Hazel. And if you've read the Padgett messages, they talk about Hazel at least 3 or 4 times. Here's the marriage license. Henry Hyde Padgett and Hazel Kirk Hamilton. Now, World War I breaks out. Henry's got experience with the railroad, and the United States just formed the United States Railroad Administration. So he went and applied to work in that administration, and he served as the secretary to Walter D. Hine, who was the Director General of the USRA. And there's a picture of Mr. Hine. And he also enlisted. We found the registration papers for Henry's enlistment. Now notice he's not going by Harry, he's going by Henry, and when he spells Hyde, he drops the E. It was because of this that we tried to find living Padgett family members. And when we presented some evidence to someone that we did find, living Padgett descendants, he says, that's not my dad. Look, it's spelled different, and it can't be my dad. So sorry. He didn't believe me. And that's fine. It wasn't enough evidence. And you know how we love evidence, right? Okay, so I continue. And if you look at the bottom, is his signature down here. And he is married, and it says Hazel right here. So he spends World War I working for the government. As I mentioned, Helen and Helenita loved Hazel, Harry's wife. And she wrote this little note in one of her messages. Give my love to the boys, and especially to Hazel, and tell her that I'm with her, and so is Mother, both trying to help her and make her expectations come true, and also cause her to be the happiest little mother in all the world. She has wonderful influences around her and should be very happy, as well as should Harry. And I know you will also. So, dear Daddy, I must say goodnight with all my love. I'm still your own loving baby. These letters are so personal. They're just like, he's just having conversations. Just happen to be dead people. So Harry and his wife Hazel have their first baby, Barbara Padgett. And then he gets a job with an oil company. He moves to New York, a little town called Rye, New York. And he gets a job with this oil company, and it requires him to travel internationally. That's good news for us because he had to get a United States passport. Guess what we found? Passport photos. And notice this one has his signature on it. He's signing it Henry instead of Harry. Henry H. Padgett. Now, Henry could never get a copy of his birth certificate. He just couldn't find it. So when he applied for a passport, he needed a legal affidavit, someone swearing under oath that he is a citizen. Well, guess who supplied that affidavit? James Padgett. And it's signed under seal and notarized. And he said, James Edward Padgett, being duly first sworn. So he's swearing under penalty of perjury, that's what that means. Deposes and says that he is a resident of the said district, and he has been such a resident for more than 60 years last past, and now resides at premises, and he gives his address. That December 15th, 1880, he was married to Helen W. Hyde, he drops the E, who is now deceased, and to whom on this 6th day of February 1884 was born a son to whom the name of Henry Hyde Padgett was actually Harry, again, drop the E, was given, and who is now identical person applying for a passport. He signs it, and look who it's notarized by. It doesn't mean anything unless you actually read the messages. Arthur Colburn. More evidence. Strange coincidence, eh? Who's this Colburn character? Were they real? We'll find out. Later that same year, Henry says, Hazel, Mexico is so great. Why don't you get the baby and come on down? Well, they needed a passport too. Here's their passport application. And this is a terrible picture, but that's the only photograph I have of Hazel Padgett and their little baby Barbara from their passport. So they got to go to Mexico. And they needed the same declaration. Well, Dad, father-in-law, can you step up to the plate one more time? And James Padgett has no problem swearing out another oath that this is his daughter-in-law applying for a passport. Now, I don't know if Harry lost his passport or if his passport was going to expire, but he applied for a second passport. So, lucky for us, we get another photograph. And there's Harry, or Henry Padgett, the second son of Helen and James. Now, they have two girls. The first one was Barbara, the second one was Harriet. At some point, Harry leaves the oil business, maybe he doesn't like the travel, and they moved to California, loaded up the truck and moved to Glendale. The girls attended Glendale High School, same high school that John Wayne attended, although he was there about 10 years before they were. This is Barbara Padgett, so this is the grandchild of, this would be the first granddaughter, and here's Harriet. These are their high school pictures from Glendale High School, Glendale, California. They both went on to get married and have children. In what year did we do this? 6 years ago? 2014, both Barbara and Harriet, Barbara was alive, Harriet had passed. We contacted the family, and this is when we had that discussion. No, it's not my father, Henry Hyde. We dropped the E, it's not the same guy. And then I says, are you sure? And then I showed him the affidavit from James Padgett. Here's James Padgett swearing that this is his son. Is your mother or your grandmother Hazel Kirk? Oh, yeah, that is. Well, look, here's an affidavit saying James Padgett is swearing under penalty of perjury that that's his daughter-in-law. So After that, he finally believed that we were indeed talking about the same Harry/Henry Hyde Padgett. And we did invite them to the 100th anniversary, but they declined. They graciously declined. But he did offer us some additional photographs that we would have never gotten had we not had the telephone conversation. This is a picture from the wedding day of Helen and James' granddaughter, Harriet. And this is a picture that they have in their home. And the person that I spoke to was a grandson, which probably would have made him a great-grandson of Padgett. So in 1953, Hazel passed away. So she predeceased her husband, Harry. But then Mr. Harry, he had a new job with an insurance company. And he loved Honolulu, Hawaii. And I was told by his grandson that his grandfather, he was impeccably dressed, and he was kind of like the meet and greet guy for this insurance company. And one of the things that he did in Hawaii is if he was going to meet and greet somebody, he'd take them out to see all of the Hawaiian entertainment. Because what do you do when you go to Honolulu? You go to a luau, you go to hear some Hawaiian music. And Henry Hyde Padgett loved all of that. He passed away in Hawaii when he was 85 years old. He lived a good life. His grandson, I told him about Padgett and the Padgett messages, and he said his grandfather was not very religious, but he was very spiritual and that he prayed often. He was also very kind, very generous. And when he was living over there by himself, he would pay for the whole family, his children and his grandchildren, to come and visit him in Hawaii. Now, he loved the Hawaiian music so much that all of the Hawaiian singers got together, took pictures, and they surrounded an older picture of Harry Padgett. They just loved him. And the grandson provided us with this photograph as well. So there we have the youngest picture of Harry Padgett, all the way through his passport pictures to in his senior years. That's the most pictures we have of any of the Padgett children. So the family had Harry's remains shipped to California, and we found out that Harry and Hazel were buried in Glendale, California. Well, heck, we're in California. We got in the car, we found out where they were buried, and we went and we took this photograph. Hazel Padgett died in 53, and Henry died in 69. His nickname was Baba. One of his children couldn't say Henry, they just called him Baba. And even the girls in Honolulu called him Baba Padgett. So, a couple of weeks after Helen turned 30, she has a baby girl. She was 30, James was 40, and they had Helenita. So now, a lot of her records came from the census. In the 1900 census, the Padgetts are living high. They're living in a home, and they even have a servant named Annie Wilson. This is just a snippet, and it's kind of hard to read, but you got James, Helen, Edward, Harry, Helenita, and down at the bottom it says Wilson, Annie, servant. So things are good for the Padgetts. Helenita's born. She attended the Hubbard School for her elementary schooling. She too liked music. And we found several clippings of her singing, and she also played the piano. Another person after my own heart. Here she performed with Wind and Tide with her classmates. In 1906, she promoted to high school. She attended Central High in Washington, D.C. And Central High, this is a picture from 1910 of Central High. And that's the year that Helenita graduated. It was 1910. So this is exactly the way it looked to Helenita when she was alive. Well, guess what? Central High is still here. And guess what? it looks pretty much the same. So if you do go to Washington, D.C., you can see the very high school where Padgett, Edward Riddle Jr.'s wife, attended Central High. Her classmates loved her so much, Helenita, when she took up tennis, they made her the tennis manager. And this is where we get our first picture of Helenita. Oh, this is a little article that says that she was elected manager of the tennis team. And in the yearbook, she had to write a little article about what's going to happen in the year for the tennis team. At the end, she says, let's hope that they make tennis a permanent feature in school athletics. Apparently, it was pretty new. Now comes the first picture. There she is on the left. How do we know? It has her name right underneath, Helenita Padgett. Love the little sporty outfit for tennis. There's a close-up picture. Now, I think she looks like Harry, and so my guess is that Harry and Helenita look like their mother, Helen, whereas Edward looks more like James. So she graduated in 1910. This is what they wrote about her. Her nickname was Dutch, or Nita, or Fate. Now, remember, that's not function key F8 because there was no computers back then. It was Fate. To know her is to love her. Love but her and love forever. Nita's greatest talent is that of making people love her. And she's a sure enough genius at that. You just can't help liking her, for she's mighty near the sweetest little girl that ever happened. Nita doesn't seem to have any very high and lofty ambition, but as she just goes on through life dispensing sweet smiles and sunshine, as she has done at Central, she will have heaps more influence than any amount of suffragettes, so keep it up, Dutch. And here's her senior picture, Helenita Dutch Padgett. The yearbook had that kind of material look, so I did Photoshop it a little bit to smooth it out, get a better picture of Helenita. Very sweet. So I mentioned 1900, the Padgetts are living high on the hog. Well, not high on the hog, but they had a house and a servant. But now comes the census of 1910, and this is the full sheet of the census. And here's a little clip. What? What happened to the Padgetts? It says that they're now boarders. See that? Border, border, border. And where are they a border? At the Hotel Stratford. I couldn't find an actual photograph of the Hotel Stratford, but this was an advertisement from 1908, just 2 years before the census. So this is what it looked like. Now, remember, James had a nice job with the government. He worked in a prestigious law firm with prestigious law partners. And now they're in this hotel. Things were not going well. So sometime after moving into the Stratford Hotel, James and Helen separated. A very sad time. Helen and Helenita moved to an apartment on Adam Mills Road, apartment number 32 to be exact. How do we know? Here's the directory, the city directory. Right there, Helen, and they listed Helen and Helenita separately, but they're both at the same address. Helen had to get a job. She got a job at the assessor's office for $2.50 a day, but it's not a full-time job nor permanent. She made that clear. On November 4th, Helen filed for a divorce seeking alimony. She sought alimony because her job was not permanent and it wasn't full-time. Also, Helen was very sick, and she would be sick for several months at a time. And she was sick very shortly after filing for this divorce. Meanwhile, Helenita's trying to move forward with her life. She is a bridesmaid in this wedding in 1910. That's the year she graduated from high school. 1911, she gets asked again to be a bridesmaid. So Helenita's trying to move on with her life, but unfortunately her mom and dad are separated. Helen is in the news again. She's dining with her friends in Phi Delta Sigma in our 1913. And then her mom passes away. Helen dies. None of us would be here if Helen didn't die first. The 12th of February, 1914, she died in a sanitarium in Warnersville, Pennsylvania. Complications due to aortic regurgitation. She was only 51 years, 3 months, and 20 days of living here in the material world. And this is a very short obituary that appeared the following day. Mrs. James Padgett died yesterday in a sanitarium, Warnersville, lifelong resident of Washington. Death was caused by heart trouble. Burial will be at Frederick, Maryland. She was survived by her husband. Notice it says husband, James E. Padgett, 2 sons, Edward R. Padgett of this city, and Harry Padgett, and a daughter, Helenita Padgett, both of Chicago. Notice it says both of Chicago. Literally just days before the 100th anniversary presentation, we obtained this copy of Helen's death certificate. So in this James Padgett story of the Padgett messages, his wife did die. She died suddenly at a young age. I noticed that the information, the historical information, was provided by this Mrs. Howard Adams. Who the heck is that? That's the married name of Helen's sister, Nancy. Now, we do not know how much or if at all that James and Helen would meet while they were separated. But we do have one of Helen's messages that she wrote to James, where she wrote the following. Many times after we had separated, did I read those wonderful letters of love in which you poured out your heart's true love to me and found so much consolation in them and wished so often that the love might be with me again as it was when I had all your love. They were very precious to me and made me live again in the happiness of the past and wish that you were still my own dear Ned as you were when they were written. That was in 1921. So that James had been receiving messages for a few years. Very touching, very personal. But we don't know if they ever got back together while she was still alive, but we do know definitively that they were still married at the time of her death. I have 2 legal opinions. And I am licensed to practice law, so I can actually give a legal opinion. I have 2 legal opinions as to why the case was dismissed. The first one, in a criminal case, the prosecutor pushes the case through the system. In a civil case, you're on your own. Helen was on her own to push her case through the system. She was represented by counsel, but it would be up to her counsel to push her case through the system and obtain a final divorce decree if that's indeed what she wanted. My second opinion is that right in the judge's notes or comments, this case was presented to the court based on the pleadings, meaning one side submitted paperwork and the other side submitted paperwork, and the judge made his decision on the paperwork. And after he read the paperwork, he dismissed the case. So I think that might have been a technicality that James was aware of, knowing that his wife was ill and he didn't want them to get divorced. He didn't file any additional evidence. He didn't take it to trial. He let it be understood or decided just on the pleadings. And then we actually found in the National Archive, this is the court's actual decree that the case be dismissed. And they charged James Padgett with the court costs accordingly. So they were still married. Who knows, it could have been a technicality, it could have been because of Helen's illness, but they were still married when Helen passed. Helenita still tried to move on. Her mom has died. And remember, in that little obit, she moved to Chicago. She wanted to be near Hazel, her buddy, and her brother Henry. And she enrolled at the University of Chicago. And we ended up getting some nice shots from a yearbook in Chicago. Now, this one didn't have any names on it, but my guess is that this is Helenita over here. You guys can look at this later and let me know what you think. But we do have another one with a name on it. And it's not the best picture of her. There she is, that middle row. And there it is. A picture's blown up a little better. So now, all the children are adults. James learns that he is a medium. What? I'm an attorney. I'm not a medium. Helen passed, and we know from the testimony that James attended a seance and met a Mrs. Maltby. Now, that sounds like a made-up name if I ever heard one. Was there really a Mrs. Maltby? Well, we started our research, and what did we find? Published in February 13. This is the day after Helen passed. There are ads in the local newspaper for spiritualism. And who is one of the mediums? Mrs. J.E. Maltby. Yes, evidence. Mrs. Maltby did exist. Here's another article about Mrs. Maltby. So if James missed that little tiny advert, maybe he saw this. Spiritualist planning anniversary exercises. Now, this one mentions a Mrs. Cates and a Mrs. Maltby. And I do believe Mrs. Cates is mentioned as well in the Padgett messages. And in some of the testimony, it said that James had read a book on mediumship, immortality, and the lives and the address. No, I can't remember the name of it. But did that book exist? Yes, it did. Here it is, Immortality or the Future Homes and Dwelling Places. So we're going to get around to James becoming a medium and the friends and associates who are these characters in the Padgett messages. First is the Colburns. Arthur Colburn, we learned there's already evidence that he's an attorney and a notary because he notarized one of the declarations for Harry's passports. And his mother, Helen Lockwood Colburn, and their daughter, Helen, we're getting way too many Helens here. Hard to keep track of them all. They were both artists and mediums. And Helen's sister, Frances Lockwood, married a gentleman named Brundage, and she was a very successful commercial artist. You may have seen these Brundage babies, as they become known, on everything, calendars, cookie tins. So that's the Colburn's sister, Mrs. Lockwood Brundage. So what are the odds that there's this family where they are all mediums? The mother, the daughter, and the son are mediums. They lived in Tacoma Park near Washington, D.C. Besides being an attorney, Arthur Colburn was a mathematician, an inventor. We found patents in Arthur Colburn's name. He was a medium and a photographer. And because he was a photographer, we were fortunate enough to find photos from the Colburn family album. This is the front of the home of the Colburns, and over here on the right, that's the old guy, is Mr. Rawlinson Colburn. And behind him is his daughter, Helen Colburn, not the mother, that's the daughter. I do not know who these people are, but I would love it if that was Mrs. Maltby or Mrs. Cates. Maybe one of our medium friends could ask who's in that photograph. And I could just see James Padgett making the trip out to Tacoma Park to attend another seance with the Colburns, going up those steps. And when he stepped into the living room, he may have saw all the artwork of Helen the mother and Helen the daughter. These sketches of African-American life in the Civil War are by Helen the mother, and they're actually in the National Archives. And there are people who print these and sell these, because how is poor Helen Colburn going to enforce her copyrights, But I've actually seen these for sale. And both Helen, the mother and the daughter, did all of the sketches for the clergy of their church. And here's some of their artwork. Arthur Colburn, attorney, mathematician, inventor, photographer, and medium. Here he is. Now, the difference between him and Mr. Padgett is he was not shy about being a medium. He would write articles and submit them to the newspaper, talk about messages from spirit. James Padgett never went public with the fact that he was a medium. As a matter of fact, he had a lot of doubt about being a medium. He didn't believe it was true. I mean, you're turning somebody's world upside down. You know, I wouldn't doubt that he had doubt. Helen Frances Colburn is the daughter, an artist and a medium. Here she's sitting on the spirit bench. Now, how do I know that? It actually says on the back of the photograph. That's the house in the back in Tacoma Park. We got these from the Historical Society in Tacoma Park, and the house is no longer there. It has been torn down, but they remember it. They remember the Colburn house. Here's Arthur and his dad. And yes, there are Padgett messages regarding the Colburns. As a matter of fact, I think at one time they advised him to stop going to seances at the Colburns. Dr. Stone, who is this mysterious doctor from England? Did he exist? He came to Washington in 1912. He studied at the Buffalo State. Is there a Buffalo State Hospital? I do declare. Yes, there it is. Buffalo State Hospital. And we know from his own testimony that he met Padgett through Arthur Colburn. So this is a serious connection. The Colburns are important. Here's a quote. I became acquainted with the Colburns through Mr. Plummer. That's William Plummer, by the way. I found them very kind and lovable people who were greatly interested in psychic experiences. It was through their son, Arthur Colburn, that I first heard of the messages that were being received by Mr. Padgett. So that is the connection, and yes, these folks really lived and really existed. He said he studied at the Palmer Gregory College of Chiropractic in Oklahoma City. Sounds like a fake place to me. I want evidence. Guess what? I actually found a certificate from the Palmer Gregory Chiropractic College. Now, it says Leslie Stone, but I added that. But if you look down here in the corner, this was given in 1912. That's the year that he did graduate from this college. So I imagine Leslie Stone had this proudly displayed in his office in Washington, D.C. So Mr. Stone knew this Mr. Plummer, William Plummer, from their days at Lilydale. And if anyone from New York or anyone who knows about Lilydale, it's the home of all the spiritualists and mediums. There's quite a few who live there. So at their time together, they had this acquaintance. And then when Dr. Stone opened a practice in Washington, D.C., Mr. Plummer plopped in one day and said, hey, I'm looking for the author of this book. Was Abraham Lincoln a spiritualist? Well, was that really a book? Yes, it was. Notice it's Mrs. Nettie Colburn Maynard. They were looking for this Colburn, and they just happened to find the other Colburn family who was associated with James Padgett. You think that's just, you know, coincidence by any chance? I don't know. Little angel guidance pushing them towards the Colburns? I think so. Dr. Stone said that he first met Padgett at his office at 6th and D. Well, was there a Stewart building on 6th and D? We didn't find this picture. A woman who was helping us find some of those college photos of the children, she found this photo for us. And yes, that's the Stewart building on 6th and D. Padgett had offices in different locations there because in the directory, the suite would change. It would be like suite 200, suite 300. So he was either in an office on the second floor or the third floor. But I think I estimated that he practiced law out of that office for about 20 years. At some point, Dr. Stone moves in with the Colburns. He's getting tired of running down there for another seance. So if you look down here, we got Rawlinson the man, the old man, Arthur the son, Helen the daughter, Dr. Well, it doesn't have to say doctor, but Leslie R. Stone, Roomer. He's boarding with the Colburns. Friends and associates, we're almost at the end, folks. I am here, George W. Harvey. Okay, who is this Harvey character? Is he a real character? He says he kept a restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue and 10th Street. Well, that should be easy enough to find. He says he's in the spirit world. Well, we found a picture of old George. Looks like he enjoyed his restaurant very much. Here's even a caricature of George Harvey. And sure enough, we even found a photograph of Harvey's restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue. This is circa 1910, so this is it would have looked like this for the entire Padgett family. And it was a very prominent restaurant, known for its steamed oysters. They sold so many oysters, they would pile up in that alley, if you could see the alley just to the right of it, the oyster shells by the barrelful. General Grant. General Grant. Well, we know General Grant lived and he became president of our country. So he came and wrote messages through Padgett. There's a colorized version of President Grant. And one of General Grant's best friends was General Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman. And I love this message that General Sherman writes. He says, well, you know, since Grant and I are close friends and when we were on Earth, and since he wrote a letter, well, I'd like to write one too. He must have been some character. And there's a picture of General Sherman. But what about some of these other characters? Well, we got Garfield. Now, why is Garfield important in the Padgett messages? Look, in his very first line, he says, your old partner's friend. Why was Garfield a friend of James Padgett's old partner? Remember, his old partner was Mr. Riddle, A.G. Riddle. Well, because James Garfield is the congressman who took A.G. Riddle's seat in the election following Mr. Riddle. So he was the one who was elected after Mr. Riddle left Congress. And they were very close friends, both back in Ohio and in their time in Washington, D.C. So I found it very interesting that he's hanging around with Riddle in the spirit world and writing messages through James Padgett. And unfortunately, fortunately, he was elected president, but unfortunately, he was assassinated as well. President Garfield. Now, why is this next man important? If someone wasn't searching for the book about Abraham Lincoln being a spiritualist, it may have never happened that Dr. Stone meets the Colburns, where he meets Arthur Colburn, who introduces him to James Padgett. I don't know. That's just my theory. Was there such a book? Yes, there was such a book. And let's answer the question. Was Abraham Lincoln a spiritualist? Well, guess what? The president comes through, gives a message to James and says, I was also to some extent a spiritualist. That is, I believe in the communications of spirits with mortals, as on numerous occasions I have had such communications and have acted on advice that I received through them. Wow! Probably the greatest president in our history was a spiritualist who was taking advice from spirit. That's pretty cool. And then he goes on to say that, but he didn't learn the truths, the higher truths of divine love when he was here on earth. He had to wait till he was over in spirit to learn that. Poor Perry. So the question from James must have been, how's our old friend Richard Ross Perry? He's another older attorney from the district, long-time prestigious attorney. And Riddle answers him, poor Perry, he's still in darkness. It's a hard matter to convince him of the truths of salvation, but we're all trying to help. So when I read this, I thought, well, what happened to poor Perry? Well, poor Perry, he shot himself. And here's a little bit of the message. He says he would shoot himself again. He was in such agony, he said he would shoot himself again in the spirit side and end his existence. And he says, I mean, annihilate my spirit and my soul. So this guy was suffering so much. Do you think they could help a guy who's suffering that much? Well, first of all, I had to find out, did this guy really exist? Did he really shoot himself? There it is, right in the headlines. Prominent member of the Washington Bar ended his own life here yesterday. And he had a son, Richard Ross Perry Jr., and he's having lunch. He tells his son, go get the car. We'll go to lunch. The son goes and gets the car, comes back, and his father killed himself. Strange story. So he's in spirit. Oh, and there's the other picture of his gravesite. And he comes back and writes a couple of messages, and he says, hi, I'm here. I'm Ross Perry. I was with you at the seance tonight, and some other people were here, Middleton, Carrington, Sylvie, other spirits he didn't know. And one of the things I noticed is that people who were not aware of divine love or the work that James was doing with spirit regarding divine love, it took them 2 to 3 months before they were able to write. Whereas people who were spiritualists, knew about spirit communication, they would write the next day or within a couple of days. So this is a couple of months after Perry had died. He's also talking about some guy named Hutchins, and Hutchins is a dark spirit, and Hutchins is just too interested on what's going on with his money that he left behind. And I thought, who is this Hutchins character? Read another article about Richard Ross Perry killing himself, and it says one of his latest important cases was the suit to break the will, the will in the Last Testament of Stilson Hutchins, the millionaire newspaper owner. Guess which newspaper? The Washington Post. This is Mr. Hutchins. He is the founder of the Washington Post. He is the spirit that Richard Ross Perry is talking about, that he's hanging around with on the other side, and that he's very dark and ugly looking. Here comes the judge. Everybody loves the judge. Judge Sirik. Now, Judge was a spiritualist, friends. So he was going to seances that James went to. And Helen says, writes a message, I'm so glad you had a day with Judge Sirik and Colonel Woods. But she's giving him the warning that, he's a spiritualist, but he's not learning the truths about divine love. In other words, he would just say, okay, spirits can talk to humans. That's all there is to learn. And he's content with that. So what do we know about the judge? Well, we know he became a Freemason. We know he spent Christmas in Atlantic City. I told you everything was in the newspaper. And he loved baseball. He loved the Washington Nationals. And when I say he loved baseball, and he was not a judge. Shock, shock. It was an honorary title somebody gave him, and it stuck, but he was not a judge. Here's the article where the Freemasons let him into the organization. I don't know if you could see it, very down here on the bottom is where they admitted Frank Sirik of Richmond, Virginia. Again, anything you do in this small town is going to be in the newspaper. He's traveling to Richmond for Christmas. So he loved baseball so much, he was a close friend of the manager of the Washington Nationals, whose name was Griffith, and close with his wife. And he knew almost every ball player on the team, both past and present. Now, in a message from Helen, she writes to her husband that Sirik's going to die soon. And that's the message. I won't read the whole thing. But the very last sentence, Padgett says, I told him, and he says he got a spirit message saying he's going to live to be 70. And Helen tells him in that last sentence, he must not believe that, or he will suddenly find that his life is not for him to live as a man of 70. I just love the way they wrote back then. She's warning him, he's going to die. Well, guess what happened? National Rooter, dead. Not Judge Sirik died. The baseball National Rooter is dead. So he must have been like the biggest fan of the Nationals, that when he died, they printed that particular headline. He was actually on his way to a baseball game with the manager. They're checking into the hotel, and he collapses and dies. The ball players are to attend. I think some of them were his pallbearers. And this last one on the right, several Griffmen. That's what the ball players who played for Coach Griffin. They were at the Sirik funeral. So he dies on the 27th. 2 days later, he's writing a message. I am here, Sirik. Let me say a word. How many messages that we see started that way? And he goes on to say these wonderful things about being on the spirit world, but I'm going to jump down to the bottom where it says, so let any doubts that you may have leave you and believe with all your heart that you have received the messages from your band and others as you have been informed. So this is March 1915. Someone who just died 2 days before is telling Padgett, get rid of the doubt. You are receiving messages. This is pretty powerful evidence, pretty powerful testimony. And we're almost to the end, folks. In this message, he tells about the beautiful soulmate that he has and how beautiful Dr. Stone's soulmate is, and also how beautiful Helen is. The most beautiful spirit he's ever seen is Padgett's soulmate, Helen. And here's Mr. I guess Judge Sirik's final resting place for his material body. And on the top is the Freemason emblem. Edwin Forrest, law partner for 18 years. Now look at the difference between Edwin Forrest and Mr. Sirik. Edwin Forrest dies. Now I didn't clip this one down because on top here we have the notice of Edwin Forrest's death. Right below it, John Surratt died. John Surratt was one of the conspirators in the Abraham Lincoln conspiracy to murder the president. He escaped, ran away for, I think it was decades. When he came back, they arrested him and prosecuted him. Guess who the prosecutor was? Albert G. Riddle. He lost. Notice how the very end of this thing that says he was acquitted. And in one of Albert Riddle's books, he said, there's several reasons why we lost. One, they changed it from a military trial to a regular criminal trial, plus the time that had elapsed. So many people, we couldn't find witnesses. Witnesses couldn't remember anything. So this person was never convicted for the murder of Abraham Lincoln. So Edwin Forrest writes his first message, and it's months after he died. Again, not days like people who are aware of divine love. And we hear that same familiar thing. I am in much darkness and suffering, and I just don't know why. I suppose it could be my evil habits. Yeah, maybe, Edward. Maybe it was those evil habits. But of course, his old law partner, James Padgett, points him in the right direction. Tell him to go see those bright spirits. And then something very sad happens. Their young daughter, Helenita, passages. She's suffering from an intestinal obstruction. She underwent surgery, but she didn't make it. She was only 25 and a half years old. That same evening, Helen Padgett came to James, try to console him after their daughter died. I was with her as she passed over and received her in my arms and told her that she was with her mother and had nothing to fear. This was such an amazing story, this family. The greatest love story ever told from spirit. There's Helenita, her high school picture. October 14, she writes her first message from spirit. And let's see if you could close your eyes, squint a little bit, concentrate really hard. Maybe we could even hear.
I am here, Nita. Let me write a line. I am Nita, and I have been so anxious to write you ever since I came to the spirit world and realized that I could do so. Well, Daddy, I cannot tell you how happy I am and how glad I am that I can write you. I know that Mother has written you in regards to my passing over and my condition and progress since I became a spirit. And all that she said is true and much more. I am so desirous of telling you in detail just what my experience has been, that as this is my first attempt to write, I will not do so tonight, but very soon I will. And I know that you will get tired before I cease writing, for I have so much to tell you.
What a wonderful message from his daughter. And I know it's probably not much condolence for a grieving James Padgett, but it's a lot more than all the people who don't believe in the afterlife or don't believe even in spiritualism where you can hear from your loved ones. At least James had that. So here's a few photos of Helenita. We had the great pleasure of traveling with our friend Dr. Elizabeth Marana at a trip to Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick, Maryland, where we went to find the resting place of the Hyde family, because that's where Helen Padgett is buried, and also Helenita. So I apologize for not asking in advance, Dr. Marana, but I'm using this picture in this presentation. Here's Elizabeth right at the Hyde family plot in Frederick, Maryland. If it wasn't for Elizabeth, I don't think we would have found it. I think she was in touch with either Helen or Helenita and literally guided us right to this, because it was covered in snow, as you can see. It's difficult to find in the winter, but we found it. That big marker, it represents the whole Hyde family, and then they have smaller markers. This one is for Helenita Padgett, and she is toe-to-toe with her mother's across from her, where it just says Padgett. After we visited the site, we drove over to the corner of the cemetery to visit the office, and we talked to a young clerk in the cemetery office, and he didn't seem very interested to talk to us at first. And Elizabeth talked to the man, and there seemed to be a pause, almost as if an angel had touched this man on the shoulder, and he says, well, hold on a minute, and he goes back, and he's scurrying through some files, and he comes out, and he brings us everything he has, which is only a few pieces of paper, regarding those buried at the Hyde family plot. And this is one of the items that he gave us regarding the internment of Helenita Padgett, intestinal obstruction. Says she was 26 years old, but she was 25 and a half, single. Notice that it says Edward Padgett is the father. That is because I still believe that the children were still estranged from their dad after the divorce, and things weren't well. And if anything, he was paying for it. So if you notice the next line, party responsible, E.R. Padgett, care of the Evening Star. So on a spring morning around 10:15, James Edward passed into spirit on March 17th. That's the wrong year. I got the wrong year. That's the year that Helen passed. And this was a very nice obituary in 1923, the very following day. It gives some history of who he worked with. It did say that he practiced with William Minogue. I told you he was just a messenger in the office in Padgett's early years. And this is the death certificate for James Padgett, which does say that he was cremated, where his remains were sent to the crematory. And I do believe in Dr. Stone's testimony, he says that they accepted the ashes. They don't say what they did with them. If anybody knows. So after doing all this research and finding all this detail about these people, do you have an abiding conviction that a certain fact is true? I have no doubt that spirits communicate with humans, with mortals. So my part was he really speaking with these people being not only his friends and associates, but also these higher celestial people who were Jesus, among others. And I have no doubt that James Padgett had an extraordinary gift to receive messages from all of the spirits that he said he received them from. Who were those characters? Where did we get that evidence? We got evidence from A.G. Riddle, that fine mustache and goatee. Evidence from Helenita herself, who passed and came back and said that everything that Mom said, told you in the messages, is true. We have the Colburn family. Without the Colburn connection, Dr. Stone might not have met Mr. Padgett. We have the testimony of Richard Ross Perry. Yes, he did get out of darkness, and if you read the Padgett messages, you're going to learn what they had to do to get Richard Ross Perry. They had to bring him a spirit of somebody who committed suicide. And guess who they brought to Richard Ross Perry to say there is hope for you? They brought him Judas. And that was the point that saved Richard Ross Perry, and he learned about divine love. We heard about the story of Frank Sirik. Dies one day, comes back, says, yes, it's great. It's great over here, especially the beautiful soulmates that we have. We have Edwin Forrest, who died, who knew nothing about divine love, and he's in darkness. So there's a lot of evidence. This is only cursory in nature. My hour and 50-minute talk would turn into probably a 4-hour talk if we went on further. We never did find a picture of Helen Padgett. We're still looking. This is a picture of Helenita. It's kind of fuzzy. I tend to think that she looks like her mother and looks like Harry. There was a medium in England who got a visit from Helen, and she tried to draw a sketch, a drawing of Helen, and this is what her impression of Helen appeared to her in spirit. Who knows? If we don't find a photograph, we're going to have to wait till we get into spirit ourselves to see what Helen really looks like. But we did find this. This is Helen's autograph. This is her signature. What a beautiful signature is. An amazing handwriting. If you've seen my handwriting, you can see why I'm so amazed. That's the closest piece of real evidence that we have from Helen Padgett. So I thank everybody from today. The most surprising thing that we found in our research for the 100th anniversary, everyone knew this picture of James Padgett, but we found another picture, and this is a picture of the young man that Helen Warman Hyde fell in love with. And this is the picture of the young, I say 20-something-year-old James Edward Padgett. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'll take any questions that anyone might have. We'll make everything available to everyone. Slides, photographs. I have a ton of newspaper clippings and other things. Thank you very much, everybody. If anyone has any questions.